Hi, everybody. This is Jimmy, and you're reading with Jimmy. Today, we're going to analyze Beowulf. We've been reading, if you read with me, there's 8 parts. We read all 8 parts. And this is going to be an analysis of this epic poem so we can understand and appreciate it better. What a story, huh? Boy, was this a story, huh? Monsters, dragons, Vikings. Holy moly. So, most historians think Beowulf was written down around the early 8th century in England. We're going to see it's between the 8th and 11th. And to get a sense of what that time was like, now it's a long time ago, right? No internet, no radio, no nothing. But we can figure out what that is by reading Venerable Bede, who died around 735, and he documented what was going on in England. He was a theologian, historian, and he chronologicalized things. And so he wrote this history of English in 731. He portrayed the 8th century England as a land in the middle of transformation, spread of Christianity. So one of the things that you're going to see in this poem, we're going to talk about the poem, is the spread of it reflects the spread of Christianity. Because there's a lot of talk about God. And you're going to wonder right away, well, I thought the Vikings had their plural gods. They have many gods, which we'll talk about. But because you read this with me, I don't think there's a page that you could turn to without a reference to God. Okay? So, before we talk about the plot and the other influences and the themes, I want to talk about the language because this is an old poem. If it was written in 8th century, it was oral tradition before that. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And if we like with Lysistrata, when we read Lysistrata or any foreign Maupassant, we have to depend on a translation. So translations are important. And if you were to try to read the original language of early English, this is what it would look like. Out! We garden in Grendel. And I can't even pronounce these words. So here's the first 3 lines of Beowulf. And we had a translator, Burton Raphael, which we mentioned every time we read and who was excellent. He translates these 3 lines this way. Hear me? We've heard of Danish heroes, ancient kings, and the glory they cut for themselves, swinging mighty swords. So he's saying that this is this. If you go to another translator, Lucian Dean Pearson, which was what Jimmy studied when he was in college, he translates these same 3 lines this way. Here we have been told the glory and days now gone of Speardanes, people kings, and how the nobles did their feats of arms. That's pretty different, isn't it, than what Raphael did, what Burton did. Now, who's right? Well, let's try a third one. Here's another version, side by side. Here's the first 3 words, right? There they are. You can see that they are. And this guy translates them this way. Lo, praise of the prowess of people kings, of spear-armed Danes, and long days sped. We have heard in what honor the Ethlings won. You can see they're all different. Is there anyone better or worse? Well, there's probably a half a dozen, and I don't think anyone is struggling, but I do want to call your attention to the hyphens. Lucian Dean uses them here. Raphael does not use them here, but he uses them throughout his translation, as we saw. We're going to talk about hyphenated words. Of spear Danes, Danes who carry spears. Of people kings, kings who are people. Pardon me. So there's no one translation better or worse. Whenever we read a translation, I want to call it to your attention. I want to put in a word about it and why I selected it. We picked Burton Raphael's, Jimmy picked this one because even though we studied Pearson's, we thought Burton's was a little bit more like the poem. It just was a little bit more like the poem. I'm going to take a sip of water. Thank you. We want to dip into the language for a moment. Aristotle said there's 6 main elements of tragedy or comedy: plot, character, diction, thought, spectacle, and song. Diction is number 3, plot's most important. But in this case, I want to start with the diction, the language. Why? Well, it's important to know the translator and the job he goes through. The translator of this edition is Burton Raphael, as I mentioned, and you can review his extensive notes. If you buy the book that he translated, Beowulf, you can read. There's like 25, 30 pages of notes in the beginning that talk about what he did when he translated this. Very impressive. But I want to summarize just one of his notes. He devotes a whole paragraph to understanding this one word. Hegemonion. I don't know how you say it. I don't speak early English. Some people read this as 2 words, he tells us. Some as an adjective, weary of mind, and some as a noun, reverence. And why is that? Well, there's different interpretations to not just early English, but English. You can pick a word, I don't know, like style, or if you're weary, tired, if you're tired, you can have different interpretations of that, right? The point is that the translator goes through a lot of trouble to make this a readable thing for us. And we have to trust them. We have to trust Raphael, right? Unless we want to take the time to learn early English for ourselves. I don't necessarily recommend that. Life is short. So you got to find trusted translators. And you may read another translation and say, write me an email, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Jimmy, I found this translation better. Well, you have a right for that, right? But this is my website, and I'm reading classics, and I chose his translation because it seems to have more of a rhythm of what the poet was doing. This is an epic poem. This was part of oral tradition, which we're going to talk about. This was meant to be said and not just read after they wrote it down in the 8th century. So he also wrote this note. What he wanted to do, what Raphael wanted to do, is to recreate something roughly equivalent in the new language, that's today's English, that carries a reasonable measure of the force and flavor of the original. And I think he did just that. All right? If you got questions, comments, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Narrator. This is a third-person narrated story. That means the narrator is outside the story talking to us. But actually, because of the nature, this is an epic poem, it makes complete sense that he should be outside, even though with the first few words. And remember, in Reading with Jimmy, if you've been reading with me for any length of time, I pay particular attention to the beginning of every story, first few lines of every story. Why? Because they're important. They're very important. They're more important than anything because they give you the narrator, they set the tone, they give you hints of what's to come. So if we read this, this is the first part of it. Hear me. We've heard of Danish heroes, ancient kings, and the glory they cut for themselves, swinging mighty swords. How Shield made slaves of soldiers from every land. Crowds of captives he'd beaten into terror. He traveled to Denmark alone, an abandoned child, but he changed his own fate, and he lived to be rich and much honored. So he's talking about this guy, Shield, right? But hear me. Who's me? Well, that's the first person, isn't it? I, me. We have. We. Who's we? First person. Well, Jimmy, how can this be third person if he starts with first person? That means he's in the story. Well, he is in the story, but where is he in the story? If you read all 8 parts with me, you can't identify the name of the narrator. And why? Because he's outside the story. Even though he uses hear me, we've heard. Why? Because he's oral tradition. He's singing the song. He's reciting the poem. He's reciting the story. And he's saying, hear me. He's calling everybody's attention. We've heard of Danish heroes. He's using the first person plural, right? He's using the we and being part of you. Even though he's not in the story, he's in the story. This is one of those rare occasions where even though it's a third person narrator, it sounds like a first person. And that is because it's oral tradition. Oral tradition. Got it? It's not immediately the genealogy he starts shaping, which we know from reading Beowulf. It's important. Genealogy is important to these people. This guy only shows up in the beginning, and he's the first Danish guy, right? And that's it. He starts the genealogy. What is oral tradition? Let's talk about that. And that's going to explain what this hear me, weave means. Oral tradition is a time when stories, histories, laws, customs were through spoken words, or they call that oral tradition. It was spoken. It wasn't written. Well, Jimmy, we're reading Beowulf. That was written. Well, I understand that because it was written in between the 8th and the 11th century by monks. We're going to talk about that. But originally it came to the quote-unquote writer of this, whoever it was, it came to him through oral tradition, which means it started way back before the 8th century as a story, was told, was retold, and retold. And as you do this oral tradition, you're going to find out they change things sometimes. And it evolves. And they do this because they don't write, and they want to remember their heritage. They want to remember the heritage, the rituals of people. So they tell these stories through oral tradition. Storytelling, poetry, songs. And it depends on the memory and skill of the storyteller because he's got to repeat this. So there's different techniques you're going to find out in a moment. So this oral tradition is all over the place in Beowulf in all these 8 parts. Anytime these warriors get together in the mead hall, they sing songs. They tell stories. Anytime, before they go confront monsters, they're going to tell stories. There's a lot of this going on in this book. For example, Hrothgar's hall resounded with the harp's high call, with songs and laughter and the telling of tales, stories sung by the court poet, as the joyful Danes drank and listened, seated along their mead benches. I hoped you used your imagination when you were reading Beowulf with me. I didn't watch the whole thing. I could only watch 5 minutes of it. There's a movie called Beowulf and Grendel. And it has a famous star in it, but I couldn't watch it because they changed the whole damn story. It was unbelievable what they did to bastardize the original story. Ladies and gentlemen, your imagination is your best writer, producer, director, caster, right? Your imagination, when you were reading with Jimmy, cast Grendel as a monster. You yourself drew what that monster looks like. You yourself drew what Beowulf looks like. But this stupid movie, and they've made more than one movie, it cast, a very famous actor as Beowulf, and he's not good in the role. He's just not good. Not only that, Beowulf was not a monster. It was just a hairy guy. It wasn't that hairy either. And it was unbelievable how they changed it. They just changed it. So, this is why oral tradition is very important. There were no movies. There was no streaming services. Everybody used their imagination. And that's why when you read this out loud with me, these words count. They should stir your imagination. Stir it, right? Help you paint the picture. Now, this takes practice. You're not going to do it offhand if you're used to watching Netflix. You're just not going to do it because Netflix interprets everything for you. Right? Why should they? Why can't you read and be your own director, be your own producer? And that's what you should do, and that's what they did with oral tradition. So there's some characteristics of oral tradition I want to call your attention to. Repetition and formula language. Ring giver. This hyphenated word is usually seen when a king gives rings or jewels to he rewards the hero for doing them a service. The repetition helps your memory, and there's a rhythmic quality. You'll see this in some of the readings we do. Maybe not, much in our translation, but if we read the original English, if we could read the original English, there would be more rhythm to it, even though Burton does a very good job of delivering the rhythm of this in line by line by line. There's also variation. Oral traditions are fluid. They're different. They change every time you retell it. How many times have we heard the story of Beowulf kill Grendel in the Beowulf epic poem? At least 3 times that I can remember. But besides the actual killing of Grendel, they tell the story of how Beowulf killed Grendel a few times. He tells it once he gets back to Geatland. He tells it again right before he kills Grendel's mom, and so on. He tells the story. Other people tell the story over and over, and that's important to the oral tradition. That's how you keep the stories fresh. But it's also how you change the story sometimes. You change the story. Community. Oral traditions are usually performed in communal settings. The mead hall. Herat was the name of the mead hall where Hrothgar ruled, right? The mead hall. They had these big halls with benches, fire in the middle, the queen serving ale, and they would gather around to tell stories. So Beowulf this is a prime example that's rooted in oral tradition, and thus the third-person narrator is talking to us. And even though it was written down between the 8th and 11th century, this story was passed down orally for generations before it was transcribed. When it was transcribed, the people who transcribed this were, in Jimmy's opinion, monks, because monks were the few people that could read and write. So this was mostly an illiterate society, even though as Christianity spread, more and more people started to learn words and how to write. But writing and books were a rich man's game or a monk's game, right? So when the monk who sat down to write this, what we're reading today, it came through oral tradition, a story repeated many times of what being a hero means, the inevitability of death. These are some of the themes we're going to explore that you should have thought about. This is not just a children's book about monsters and a hero. It is, but it's much more. It's much more because it's really about profound questions, facing death. What does courage mean, etc.? What is evil? So, anyway, Beowulf was composed at a time when literacy was rare. Oral tradition was the primary means. People talked. They talked. And when they talked, they told these stories about here. They wanted examples of heroism. And then as Christianity started to seep in to England, or to Norway, to Danish areas, that's where you find the influence that we're going to talk about in a moment about God in this epic poem. But I want to give you one more note about the language. Translators of Beowulf, they use these hyphenated words to make more vivid description. And for example, a ring-proud fighting ship. Do you know what that is? When we read that, when we were reading with Jimmy, these are the ships these Vikings, these Norsemen use. Ring-proud fighting ship. So if you look, what is a prow? A prow, and this is why it's important to look stuff up in order to appreciate this language charged with meaning. It's the front portion of the ship's bow above the water that's pointing forward. So ring-proud means there's a round curved prow. It's round and curved. Very similar to what you see in Viking movies. If you saw the movie Long Ships, which is a Sidney Poitier movie, it's very, very old. I don't even know if they show it anymore. It's a great movie to show Vikings. I think Richard Widmark is in there too. But if you've never seen a movie about Vikings, that still doesn't deter you from using your imagination once you know what a ring-proud ship looks like. So picture in your mind what it looks like. It should add to your appreciation. In fact, the ships were built, you can look it up. Go to Google and say ring-proud ships. They'll show you pictures. They'll also tell you more about it. They were built with wooden planks, intricate carvings. Remember, they didn't read, so they carved intricate carvings. They were master craftsmen. On the hull depicting symbols like dragons and knotwork. The longships, as they were called, were equipped with a single mast and a square sail. This is what you can find defined, featuring a simple striped pattern. The narrator of Beowulf would have assumed that the listeners know what he meant when he said ring-proud ship, ring-proud fighting ship. Therefore, it's in our interest to pay attention to these hyphenated words, because if we're in the audience listening to him narrate, and he assumes, and it's always dangerous to assume, why? Because you make an ass out of you and me, right? We don't want to do that. We want to understand what he's saying. They say a picture's worth 1,000 words, but I'm telling you right now, the 1,000 words you get in Beowulf are worth a picture. And these 3 words will give you a stunning picture once you start understanding what the words mean, and then using your vivid imagination to paint a picture of not only the ship, but the people, the monsters, and the settings. So use your imagination or use AI. Jimmy went to AI and he asked, AI a question. And did the ship in your imagination look like this? Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that beautiful? Well, Jimmy, I've done extensive research for 20 years, and there were never that many shields along the side of the ship. In fact, there's the knots, right? But there were only 4 shields from what I've gathered in the 20 years of research. Well, that's good. And frankly, the number of shields doesn't matter. But this, see the ring proud? There it is, the ring proud ship. This is what they look like. Jimmy went to AI and said, create an image of a ring proud Norseman ship from the time of Beowulf. And this is the picture I got. Now, you don't have to have AI know how to use AI to do this. You can go to Google and say, show me images of a ring-proud ship from the time of Beowulf. And you should get a similar thing. So the point is to use your imagination. And there's other hyphenated words that are important to use your imagination. Terror struck. He turned and ran for his life. He was terror struck. He was struck with terror. Well, Jimmy, why don't they just say struck with terror? Because there's something about the hyphenated word that gives a certain rhythm to reciting it. Like, when Jimmy read it to you, he was reading it with gusto. Battle brave king. The king was brave in battle. You're falling asleep. The battle brave king. The battle brave king rested. Isn't that beautiful? Battle hardened shields. Well, Jimmy, doesn't that mean that the shields were strong? Yes. Battle hardened. Would you rather be strong or battle hardened? You see what I'm saying? Ring giving Lord. Lords give rings, right? Treasure full hands. He filled his hands with treasure until he couldn't carry it anymore. Treasure full hands, says it. Oak hard boat. Hell forged hands. I wonder who he's talking about there. So there are many, many, many more hyphenated words, but they give a quality to this epic. And really, truthfully, a kind of grace, the way he translated it, the way Burton translated it. And the narration, and hope you got that from Jimmy's narration. Okay, let's get into the plot. I always use Aristotle when I'm talking about stories and classics because Aristotle knew what the hell he's talking about. No one's ever replaced them. Plot has 6 elements. Plot's the most important. The first 2 are primary, plot and character. So the most important is plot, and which is, what is plot? It's the representation of human action. And boy, is there a lot of action in this story, isn't there? So plots can be simple or complex. Aristotle indicates complex plots are required for successful stories. And here's a nice footnote. You can pause my narration and read this for yourself. I'm not going to read it all to you. But it's important to understand what Aristotle's trying to say. Beowulf is a complex plot, although when we finish and before we finish, you're going to think it's a simple plot because the fact of the matter is this is a story with one central theme, good versus evil. I'm going to prove that to you. But it's complex. Why is it complex? Because it involves humans who are complex. Even though some of these human characters, as you'll see when we talk about character, are clearly either good or evil. It has to be unified, and it has to display a beginning, a middle, and an end, which Beowulf does, right? It starts, we're going to talk about that in a moment, but it meets this definition of plot. So, what is the plot? This is a short summary of what we read. It's an Old English poem. It's a classic. It's probably the most important work of Anglo-Saxon literature. I studied it when I was in college, majoring in English. I never read the original, as I mentioned, but you read translations. And I selected it because it is, in fact, a classic. It's a tremendous work with monsters and heroes. It's Viking territories, and we meet Beowulf, who's a Geat warrior who comes to the aid of Hrothgar, the king of the Danes. Hrothgar's mead hall has a problem. The monster Grendel comes at night and he eats his warriors. Hrothgar is helpless. Grendel is a monster who comes at night to eat his warriors. He's a cannibal. Hearing of Hrothgar's problem, Beowulf decides to help. Beowulf is renowned for his strength and bravery. He has the strength of 30 men. It says that in the book. The narrator tells us that. And he sets out with a group of his men. How many? I think 14. Hrothgar welcomes him, hoping Beowulf will be able to rid them of the monster Grendel, which he does. There's a great battle. Grendel comes into the hall. He kills one guy, one of the Geats, and then he grabs Beowulf, and you know the rest of the story. He rips off Grendel's arm, who runs away, mortally wounded. He's going to die when he leaves. And Beowulf hangs Grendel's arm in Herat. That's the name of the mead hall. Hrothgar's mead hall is named Herat. They would name their weapons. They would name their hall. Sometimes they name their jewelry. But he hangs Grendel's arm as a trophy. Well, the bad news is Grendel has a mom who seeks revenge for her son's death. And she attacks the hall and kills Escher, which is one of Hrothgar's advisors. Beowulf, again, vows to help, so he tracks the creature down to her underwater lair where he finds a giant sword and uses it to kill Grendel's mother. And he returns to Herat, not with all the jewels that are around him that he could take, but he only takes Grendel's head as a trophy. Okay? There's a great scene with 4 guys carrying the head after they speared the head, but Beowulf carries Grendel's head and just carrying it himself. Why? Because he's strong. So after these victories, Beowulf goes back to Geatland with a bunch of gold and jewels that Hrothgar gives him for helping him, where he's welcome as a hero, and he carries these many gifts back. And eventually he becomes king of the Geats, because remember, he wasn't. He was his uncle, Hygelac, was the king. And he rules for 50 years, and then another monster comes, the dragon. And the dragon begins terrorizing his kingdom after a thief who was a slave steals a cup from the dragon's treasure. Dragons guarded their treasure very carefully. So Beowulf goes on to confront the dragon, and he kills it. with the help of the young warrior named Wiglaf, but Beowulf was mortally wounded and he dies. But before he dies, he tells Wiglaf to build him a tower from which, for him by the sea so that sailors can see it and then remember his deeds. Remember, Beowulf's after glory. We'll find that out. So Beowulf's dead. I think every time I see a lighthouse now, I think of Beowulf because that's what I'm imagining. My imagination said build a tower by the sea. There's only one kind of tower I know by the sea, and that's a lighthouse. Beowulf's death marks the end of the poem. At that, it has the criteria, it meets the criteria defined by Aristotle. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And we also see the characters develop that we're going to talk about next. And they have traits, character traits, that inspire the people who would listen to this poem. Aristotle said tragedy and plot should involve well-developed characters. We need characters to have a plot. And they should change and grow throughout the story. Not every one of them, but the main ones. Characters should be believable, multidimensional, and they should have motivations and desires that drive their actions and interactions with characters. And I think if we pause there for a moment, we can say that's exactly what happens in this story. Pardon me, I took another sip of water. Beowulf seems to have such characters, wouldn't you agree? So here they are. This is a brief review. Beowulf, brave, strong, loyal. He's motivated by a desire for glory. He's also wise. He's also aware. We're going to go into his character more shortly. But he doesn't change much, does he? He comes in strong. He leaves strong. He's always brave. He's always fearless. He never doubts himself. And he's a quiet hero when you look, as we will shortly, at his youth development into a man. So I don't think he was born to be a hero. I think he became a hero. Hrothgar is the king of the Danes who needs help. He's generous. He's wise. He was a warrior, but he can't protect his people. He has pretty good compassion, and you're going to see he gives Beowulf very good advice. But he's helpless against evil. So this is good and evil. Beowulf is good. Hrothgar is good. But he's not really good enough to beat Grendel, like Beowulf. So Grendel is a monster descended from Cain, C-A-I-N. If you know your Bible, you know who that is, and we'll look at that shortly. But he's therefore evil. He's evil. He's isolated from humans, savage, the cannibal. Grendel doesn't change. He doesn't really change, except when he's confronted by Beowulf. If you remember the scene, first he eats one of the geese, and then he grabs Beowulf and put him in his pouch for later. But Beowulf grabs him back. And the minute Beowulf grabs him back, Grendel realizes something isn't going to go right. He realizes he changes from a fierce, savage cannibal, right, into he feels fear. And eventually good destroys evil. Then there's Grendel's mother, who's also evil and fierce, but she's revengeful. She seeks revenge because, Beowulf killed her son. She's fierce. She gives Beowulf a run for his money, but she also is killed. Then there's the dragon. Well, Jimmy, is a dragon are these monsters characters? Of course they are. Greedy, vengeful, lethal. This dragon's lethal. Once that guy steals the cup, that dragon goes on a rampage, burning the city, just setting fire to everything, flying around at night. And they've been around for a long time. You'll see a footnote a little later. Different cultures saw dragons differently. In Christian and chivalric traditions, chivalry, dragons are the symbol of evil. So it's no wonder the dragon in Beowulf is evil, because it is evil. But Beowulf kills the dragon, but he also dies as a result of the fight. Then there's Wiglaf, who's a loyal, brave, honorable warrior. He surfaces at the end to help Beowulf when he needs it most. Inspiring is action and also brave. There are some excellent lines we'll read about. Then there's this guy, Unfrath, if you remember him. When Beowulf first showed up, this guy did not like Beowulf. He was jealous of Beowulf. Yeah, this guy is a big shot, right? He was jealous, but after he kills Grendel, he changes his tune. I think of all the people we just talked about, Unfrath is the guy who changes. In fact, he changes so much, he gives Beowulf one of his swords. He was jealous of Beowulf, but then he realized just what a hero he is, and he changes his tune. And here's some minor characters. You have Beowulf's uncle, Wethlo, which is the gracious, wise wife of Hrothgar, and Esher, who was eaten by Grendel's mother. So, according to Aristotle, there are 4 goals when you create these characters. Whenever the guy who started the oral tradition of Beowulf created characters, you want to have goodness. They should be good. Of course, you could portray evil, but you really need good character, someone representing good. Beowulf is good, as evidenced by killing evil. The monsters are evil. There's clear lines, but there is also, I want you should have paid careful attention, that there's a certain distrust beneath the interactions if you look close enough to these characters. They value weapons, they value gold, but they don't trust each other all the time. It takes Hrothgar a while to trust Beowulf when he shows up. If you remember, Beowulf is greeted when he lands there, and the guy wants to know immediately why you're here. Because these Norsemen, these tribes, these countries fought each other all the time. You saw the beginning of the poem where Shield came in and just captured all these people, made them slaves. I mean, these are fierce, fierce warriors fighting all the time. So they don't trust people easily. So Hrothgar, once he trusts Beowulf, and Beowulf delivers on his promise to kill Grendel, there's a certain bond that's created between them, between the king, Hrothgar, and Beowulf. And there's also less about proprietary. The characters have to behave according to their social rank. They fight each other all the time, as we've seen in the first few lines. He made, crowds of captives that he beat into terror. This is the top Dane guy that started the genealogy. But interestingly, it was a slave who steals the cup from the dragon and in the end causes the death of Beowulf. If you had the root cause of why Beowulf died, it's because of this slave. Now, according to Aristotle, social rank, should a slave do this? Well, the slave uses the cup to buy his freedom. We'll talk about that. But eventually he leads everybody back to where the dragon lives. But that doesn't change the fact that Beowulf, right, dies because of what this slave did. What if he didn't do it? He was someone's slave and had been beaten by his masters, had run from all men's sight, but with no place to hide, he found a hidden path, and that's when he found where the dragon was. So he steals this cup. He bought his master's forgiveness with the cup, begged for mercy, and was pardoned when his delighted lord took the present he bore and turned it in his hands and stared at the ancient, this is an old cup, right, full of jewels. The cup brought peace to a slave, but pleased the master, but stirred the dragon's anger. So the cup brought peace to the slave, pleased the master, but it stirred the anger. This is an important lesson. There are positives and negatives to every action you take. We read in order to figure out how other people lead their lives in order to lead ours. And one of the premier lessons of Beowulf is this. For every action, there's not only a reaction. For every action you take, something good and bad happens. Think about chess. When you make a move on the chessboard, you gain something and you lose something, right? What's the object of chess? It's to checkmate the king. How do you checkmate the king? You make moves in a certain way and where you gain more than you lose. Because every time you make a move with a chess piece, you gain something, but you also lose something. You become vulnerable. So life is like chess, and so is this. There are positives and negatives to every action that's taken. If Beowulf did not kill Grendel, Grendel's mother would not have killed Escher, right? You see what I'm saying? So as you go through life, it's important to not only read and learn like we're doing now with Beowulf, but it's important to understand this line right here. There's going to be pros and cons to everything you do. Just make sure the moves you make have more positives than negative. And credibility, vermicelitude. Characters should be believable. We have to believe these people. Attributes to the characters should be expected. Well, Jimmy, I don't believe in dragons. That's bull. Well, we're going to talk about that. All right? Look at this line here. How do you define a monster? What is a monster? You think a monster has just got, dragon and fiery breathing dragons and Grendel cannibals? You think monsters are just cannibals? You've never met a monster in your life? There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. That's from Hamlet. Jimmy read Hamlet on this website. Hopefully you've read it with me, and if not, you should. There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. How do you define a monster? Jimmy thinks you may have, in fact, met a monster. We're going to talk about monsters in a bit because Jimmy has met some monsters and he's met some heroes. And consistency. Their behavior has to be consistent. What would it be like if Beowulf, when Grendel grabbed him, ran away? What if the narrator told us, suddenly Beowulf felt doubt in his mind and he ran away? What a difference that would make. And there's no indication that he would ever run because this guy is fearless. He's fearless. He's got courage. Not stupid courage, not crazy courage, but he's courageous. We'll talk about this. So these people are consistent, I would say. Would you? And then finally, this Latin phrase here means God from the machine. What does that mean? That means something that happens that, where the hell did that come from? You've seen this in movies sometimes where people are behaving in a certain way and then suddenly where the hell did that come from? That's this machine. There's deus ex machina, right? They behave like a machine. That doesn't quite fit. And then there's the themes of heroism, struggle between good and evil, loyalty, and reflections on responsibilities of kingship, the importance of your reputation. So this is a poem like heroic poems like Iliad and Odyssey. And they have examples of strength, courage, honor, cowardness, all of that. It was written well after it was composed and recited. Remember, they started reciting it, and then it was written down. And as it was written down as Christianity started spreading throughout the North, Denmark, England, all that. And the people who wrote it down, this is Jimmy's guess as well as your guess, were monks. Monks had the ability to write and read. So some monk started hearing this oral tradition. Maybe he heard it by a traveling minstrel or whatever. And he says, I got to write this down. I am going to write this down. So he did. And as he was writing it, because he was a monk, Christian, right? That's how Jimmy believes God got into this story. I'm going to prove that to you. Because you can't turn a page in Burton's translation without seeing God. God is everywhere in this story. But you're going to start saying, wait a minute, Jimmy, the Norsemen had their own mythology. They didn't just have one God. If you know anything about Norsemen and Vikings, you know what I'm about to tell you is true. So we're going to start the discussion about the influence of God in Beowulf. And there's a strong influence, as I said. You can see how Bede discusses what's going on, how Christianity was spreading. And there was only one God in this story. There's not multiple gods like the Norsemen had. This poem was composed in a time where Christianity was spreading. But the Norseman mythology, which Jimmy loves mythology, not just Greek mythology, but any mythology, because mythology has a certain amount of truth to it. Norseman mythology had multiple gods. Ready? The first one was Odin. Odin! If you've never seen Kirk Douglas and Tony Curtis in a movie called The Vikings, you should. Kirk Douglas's father dies. The Vikings used to believe you have to die with a sword in your hand. That's how you should die. Spartans believe that too. On your shield, or carrying your shield, or on your shield after a war. So, and there's a great scene in the Viking movie where Kirk Douglas's father jumps into the pit full of lions and stuff and screams, "Odin!" as he's holding, somebody threw him, Tony Curtis threw him a sword because they were just going to throw him in there. And the guy said, Ernest Borgnine played the role. And he said, I can't go without a sword. So Tony Curtis threw him a sword, and he looks at everybody. Now everybody's petrified because this Viking got the sword. He's going to kill us all. But instead, he looks at everybody, screams at them, and then he jumps in screaming, Odin! Odin! Of course, then they cut off Tony Curtis's arm because he gave him the sword. But that's another story. Then there was Thor. They made movies about Thor. And these other gods, Freyr, Loki, you remember Loki in the movie Thor? He was a trickster. Not one of these is in this story. Not one of these gods is in this story. So I'm going to bet that before this was written down, way back when the first story of Beowulf was told, they didn't have God in it. They had these gods. Odin was in it, and I'm going to prove that to you in a moment. Then by the time the 8th century rolled around, and this, remember, oral tradition, it was repeated and repeated and repeated. Christianity starts flowing in and starts affecting the way people think. Slowly but surely, God, the God of the Christians, started replacing the gods of the Norsemen. And that's what we have today in this written Beowulf. The written version of Beowulf has one God, the Christian God. And here are some references that the Christian, and I'm telling you right now that you know what I just told you, you can almost feel the influence of the Christian monk writing the story of Beowulf. You can feel it. I'm going to point that out to you. It was said, pay attention to this. It was said, this is line 665, so it's early in the 3800 lines, right? It was said that God himself had sent a sentinel in Herat, that's the mead hall, brought Beowulf as a guard against Grendel and a shield behind whom the king could safely rest. So this is saying that maybe God brought Beowulf, because one of the central questions you have to ask yourself is why Beowulf came. Why did he go to Hrothgar's? He heard about Grendel. Now, Grendel's been eating these people for 12 years. Beowulf hears about it. Why does he go? Why does he decide to pick up and go? And we're going to talk about that. Is it because God told him to go? It was said. That doesn't mean it was. It was said that God himself had set a sentinel in Herat. That's Beowulf, right? Here's some more. Okay. But God, this is a beautiful line. I can't say this line often enough. But God's dread loom was woven with defeat for the monster, good fortune for the Geats, and help against Grendel was with them. And through the might of a single man, they would win. Who doubts that God in his wisdom and strength holds the earth forever in his hands? Take this first part. This is not only foreshadowing. Do you remember what Jimmy told you about when we were reading about foreshadowing? This little line here, okay? Murdered by Grendel in a hall where Geats and now not Danes now slept. Okay. This is called foreshadowing what's going to happen. God's dread loom. Do you know what a loom is? You should look it up. It's where you use it to create yarn, right? And then you use the yarn to make clothes. So this is not just a loom, it's a dread loom. God's dread loom was woven with defeat for the monster. That's a beautiful line of poetry. Good fortune for the Geats, right? Read this. Who doubts that God, in his wisdom and strength, holds the earth forever in his hands, capital H. Can you see the monk writing that? Pause a moment, go back 8 centuries, go back to the beginning, to the first time that Beowulf was ever recited in the oral tradition. Use your imagination with me. Let's go back in time. Let's take the time machine, right? And go back in time, right? Change God to Odin, because Odin, if you remember, Odin is the god of wisdom, war, and death. He's the top god. He's the top god, right? But Odin's dread loom was woven with defeat for them. That, you see how it fits? You see how it fits? Who doubts that Odin, in his wisdom and strength, holds the earth forever in his hands? You see what I'm saying? So oral tradition-wise, 8 centuries before it was written down, I am absolutely positive. Oh, how can you be positive? You didn't live. You didn't know. There's no record. No. Let's use common sense and logic. Let's go back in time and think about this and just say to ourselves, right, what the hell's going on here? Well, the monks wrote it. They, maybe by then they were already reciting it with the word God. I don't know. But you see, it fits the Norse mythology. Let me give you a few more. Out of the marsh, from the foot of misty hills and bogs, bearing God's hatred, Grendel came, hoping to kill anyone he could trap in his trap. He's bearing God's hatred. God hated Grendel. Why? Because Grendel is evil. He's evil. Can Odin be substituted for this? Why not? But you could see, because, right, we're going to find out he's descended from Cain, the influence of Christianity on Beowulf. Then and now, men must lie in their Maker's holy hand. This is a kind of determinant, and hands moved only as he wills. This is called determinism, that, in other words, we don't have really the freedom of choice. God determines what's going to happen to us. This is not the place to have a sidebar about determinism, but you should be aware of it, because I already told you, it is said that God told Beowulf, get your butt over there to help Hrothgar. Or did Beowulf make that decision himself? It really doesn't matter. He's there. He goes. This presents an entirely different. Did Beowulf help because he wanted to, or because God moved him to? This is very interesting to me, and I hope it is for you. So here's another example. I can hear the monk scribbling, right? As only he can. He who rules time and seasons. He who is truly God. The eternal Lord loosens invisible. See, this is a God. And if you go back in time, right? All that Beowulf took was Grendel's head. This is after he kills the mother. Can you see them? Can you feel the monks translating this? A few more, and then we'll go on. So God gives guidance to those who can find it from no one else. This is very important. We're going to revisit that line. God gives guidance to those who can find it from no one else. And when the dragon arrives, this is very important. It's more important than anything that I can think of in this epic poem. Beowulf's sorrow. This is after they came to Beowulf because the dragon just burned the shit out of the town. Beowulf's sorrow beat his heart. Think about this. Listen to the words. Beowulf's sorrow beat at his heart, and he accused himself of breaking God's law, of bringing the Almighty's anger down on his people. Ladies and gentlemen, that's an unbelievably written line. That line is so powerful. Think about this. This is Beowulf, who's just killed two big monsters 50 years ago. Now he's got this dragon burning the hell out of his town. And the first thing he does is blame himself. Where do you see that happening today around you? Who takes the blame for anything these days? Who says, it's my fault, and beats their chest? Who does that? Who does that? I'll tell you who does that. A true hero, a true heroine. Blame yourself first. It's an unbelievable line. Who knows when princes and their soldiers, the bravest and strongest men, are destined to die? Their homes, okay. So God must decide who will be given death's cold grip, which leads us to the main theme between good and evil. Sorry. Isn't that good? Beowulf, let me take a sip. Beowulf is essentially a story, is about good and evil. Loyalty, human nature, brave, coward. It's a marvelous tale, and Jimmy's very glad it survived all these centuries. I would have loved to have written a story like that. Now, by the way, you know J.R. Tolkien took a lot from this story, right? With the dragon, the jewels, somebody stole the treasure, which is okay. My hat's off to J.R. Tolkien. He wrote some nice stories. They're not classics, but they're good stories. So how do I know this, that it's a struggle? Well, look at the main characters. You got Beowulf, who's good, Grendel, who's evil, Grendel's mother, who's evil, and finally the dragon, who's evil. And you have all these other supporting casts, right? But Grendel is evil and Beowulf is good. We find this out right from the get-go, from the start. Grendel has haunted the moors, and made his home in a hell, not hell, but earth. Listen to this language. Grendel, was spawned in that slime, conceived by a pair of those monsters born of Cain, murderous creatures, banished by God, punished forever for the crime of Abel's death. And the Almighty drove those demons out, and their exile was bitter, shut away from men. They split into 1,000 forms of evil spirits, fiends, goblins, monsters, giants, a brood forever opposing the Lord's will, and again defeated, which means they're going to lose, right, to good. What a marvelous piece of writing. Marvelous piece of writing. This reminds me of Ghostbusters when they release all the evil demons. But they talk about Cain and they talk about Abel, right? Cain and Abel. Do you know the story of Cain and Abel? The King James Version of the Bible is what I believe that we should always refer to. That's the translation, King James version of it. And that's the version Jimmy likes to read. It's not the official quote-unquote Catholic version, but that's okay. So it was the monks who probably transcribed the poem because they put in Cain and Abel, right? Well, who was Cain and Abel? And Adam knew Eve, and she conceived, and she bore Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. And she again bore his brother Abel. And Abel was the keeper of sheep, and Cain was the tiller of soil, of the ground. And in the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought the fruit of the ground as an offering to the Lord. And Abel brought the firstlings, the first of the right of his flock, and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect for Abel and his offering, but unto Cain and to his offering he had no respect. So Cain was very wroth. What is wroth? and his countenance fell. His countenance fell. He just wore, right? And the Lord said unto Cain, why are you wroth? Why is your countenance fallen? If thou dost well, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou doesn't do well, sin will be at your door. And unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. That's a strange line, and we can spend an hour talking about it, but I won't. So Cain talked with Abel, his brother, right? That's apparently what he interpreted God saying. And it came to pass that when they were in the field, Cain rose up and slew his brother. He kills Abel. Story of Cain and Abel. Maybe you've heard it, maybe you haven't. The Lord said to Cain, where's Abel? And he said, I don't know. I'm not my brother's keeper. And he said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries to me from the ground, blah, blah, blah. And now you are cursed from the earth, from which had opened their mouth to receive your brother's blood. And when you till the ground, it will henceforth yield, unto thee her strength, a fugitive, and you're going to be a vagabond. And he curses Cain. Okay. He also puts a mark on Cain, so that because Cain says, well, Jesus, they're just going to kill me. He said, no, I'm going to put a mark on you, and anybody that kills you, I'm going to kill him sevenfold. So Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, dwelt in the land of Nod, east of Eden, which is a great Steinbeck classic. Maybe we'll read it. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. So Cain gets married, and he's gone. He kills his brother, and he's gone, blah, blah, blah. So Grendel is descended from Cain, right? We see in Beowulf genealogy is important, not just because of what Cain and Abel is with the monsters. Pardon me, but genealogy with the monsters. So Grendel's evil, Beowulf's good. How evil is Grendel? The narrator tells us, no crime could ever be enough, and no savage assault quench his thirst, his lust for evil. That's pretty evil, wouldn't you say? And he preyed on his warriors, Hrothgar's warriors, for 12 years. 12 years. So Beowulf, Hygelac is his uncle, right? He's stronger than anyone anywhere in the world. He heard how Grendel filled knights with horror, so he quickly commanded a boat fitted out, proclaiming he'd go to the famous king and sail to Hrothgar now when help was needed. So none of the wise ones regretted his going, much as he was loved by the Geats. He was loved by the Geats by that time. And so the omens were good, and they urged the adventure on. So Beowulf chose the mightiest of men, 14, and off he goes. So he's going to go fight Grendel. Think for a moment of how we met Beowulf. This is what I want to call your attention to. So this guy's going now to fight Grendel. Whether you believe God sent him or he just decided to go because Hrothgar needed help, and he's a strong guy. Glory is what Beowulf sought. This is the narrator telling this. He wants glory. Not killing his comrades in drunken rages, his heart not savage, but guarding God's gracious gift, his strength, using it only in war, and then using it bravely. So the gracious gift from God was Beowulf's strength. But he didn't waste it in drunken rages. That tells you something about the community, right? Think about Samson, another great figure from the Bible, right? He had the gift of strength too. Look at this. And yet, as a boy, Beowulf was scorned. He was scorned. The Geats considered him worthless. And when he sat in their mead hall and their lord was making men rich, Beowulf held no claim on the king's goodwill. And they were sure Beowulf was lazy, noble, but slow. Can you imagine this? When he's a kid, right? He's a young man, he's a boy. He's scorned. The Geats considered him worthless. He was lazy, noble, but slow. And yet, he's such a hero. Huh? So there is change. He changes. He changes. This is the character development Aristotle's talking about. Was he like that, or did they just perceive him? It shows us how brave Beowulf really is. He never hesitates, and he's after fame. Beowulf longed only for fame. Only for fame. He wants fame. I want you to think about that because Achilles wanted fame too. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So if Grendel is evil, his mother is evil, and no one has to tell us about the evil of dragons. And there's a footnote you can read about dragons. We talked about dragons. So what do you do when you are confronted by evil or a dragon? What do you do? Or do you think that these kinds of dragons we saw in Beowulf are only in stories like this, that there's no such thing as dragons in the world or monsters? What is courage? Have you thought about what is courage? They tell us that courage is the ability to do something that frightens you. Something that frightens you. What frightens you? What is fright? Well, fright is the sudden intense feeling of fear. You get afraid. So when you're confronted and you feel freer, say that 5 times, do you act or don't you act? What do? Do you cower? Do you stick your head in the sand? Or do you fight or flight? Flight or fight? That's a common saying. Sometimes it takes courage to confront news, doesn't it? You go to a doctor, you have cancer. Oh my God, what do? Do you retreat? Oh my God. Or do you face the monster like Beowulf did? Well, Jimmy, what are you telling us here? Are you telling us that this is more than a monster story? Yes. I'm telling you that there's an oral tradition we read to see how other people lead their lives and how we should lead ours. This is very important. How do you confront your fear? What are you afraid of? What are you really afraid of? One of the underlying messages in here, of course, is death. I mean, there's death all around here, right? How does Beowulf confront death? How do these warriors confront death? Before you say there's no monsters or dragons in the world, think about what you're saying. Are you sure you don't see them? You should define your terms. What if your monster is your boss or a bully next door or whatever? My wife was in a serious car accident, and after she was she broke her jaw in 3 places. And after recovery, it took a long time, she went back to work. She came home from the first day of work, and she started telling me, she's very still fragile. I mean, you can imagine, right? Physically like that. She goes to work, she comes back, and she starts telling me the story of how her boss treated her. And I said, stop. After she started talking for about, a few minutes, I said, stop. And I said, give me a second. I took out my computer, I opened the computer, and I said, start all over again. I'm gonna transcribe what you said. And I typed 75 words a minute at least. Those days probably faster. And she started narrating and I started typing. And when I finished, I saved my file and she said, what did you do that for? I said, well, I'm going to drive over to his house and beat the shit out of him. No, you can't do that. So we had a little discussion about that. And she calmed me down. She usually saves me. she usually saves me from myself. I said, so I'll tell you what I'm going to do with this. I'm going to print it out and I'm going to fax it over to HR. She worked for a very, very big company, very big company. And I said, I'm going to just fax it to the HR lady who knows what you just went through physically. And I'm going to just tell her, what do you think you should do about this? And I did. And within an hour, they pulled her out of the department, put her in another department and fired the guy. That's how abusive this asshole was. It was abusive. And he was lucky she talked me out of that, out of doing what I wanted to do. I'm just saying there's dragons everywhere. So I want to review some of the very, very good lessons that Jimmy walked away with from this great story. Push away pride. This is Hrothgar's advice. You can go back and read this, and pride is one of the 7 deadly sins and was first listed by Pope Gregory. St. Thomas Aquinas talked about it. Dante put pride at the foot of Mount Purgatory. Pride is really the root of all evil. Pride, too much pride. If you have pride, hubris, they call it hubris, Hubris. Pride goeth before destruction. Pride cometh before the fall, and a haughty spirit before the fall, right? Is in Proverbs, the book of Proverbs. Think about it. So Hrothgar's advice, guard against such wickedness, pride. Beloved Beowulf, and choose instead eternal happiness. Push away pride. Your strength, your power are yours. For how many years? It's going to come. Death will come faster than you think. No one can flee it. Remember that. Okay. Pride. Don't be prideful. Well, Jimmy, does that mean you can't have pride in your work? You certainly can have pride in your work. You should have pride in your work. But remember, it's don't you put on your pants the same way in the morning as everybody else. There's no one, I mean, you may be very good at something, but too much pride will nip you in the bud before you know it. To be ready for war whenever they rested it if trouble came to their king. These people were warriors. They slept with their weapons. They slept with their shields, right? They were always ready. Be prepared. That's the lesson. Be prepared. You don't know what's going to happen. I'm not saying sleep with your shield and spear, but I'm saying be prepared. Look around you. They call it situational awareness, right? Law enforcement has situational awareness, not just when you're at a restaurant eating. I'm talking about events around you. Situational awareness. And you prepare, you practice to overcome your fear. Death comes faster than you think. Isn't that true? Well, you have to understand time to understand fast, right? Fast is time. What is time? Time is relative. Earth has 24 hours because it spins. Einstein proved time is relative, right? Well, it is. The faster you go, the slower it goes, whatever. We can talk about that another time. You define time. This time you're spending with Jimmy, analyzing Beowulf, you and I will never get this time back. In fact, I'm going to admit something to you. I started recording this earlier today, and I made a huge error. I stopped the recording, but I really didn't stop it, and I didn't really start it again. So I'm doing this over again. I wish you could have heard the first one. No, just kidding. Sorry. Time is relative. You've heard this right. There's nothing certain but death and taxes. It's certain. We're all going to, all living things die. Blaise Pascal, a great mathematician, said absolute rest is death. It's not when you're going to do it. It's how you're going to do it. That's the important question. You know you're going to do it, but how are you going to do it? Are you going to cower? Zorba the Greek is a nice story, right? Are you going to live like you're going to die at any moment? Or are you going to live like you're going to live for and never die, ever? Those are two different philosophies, right? And how about learning from, how did Beowulf face death? He was fearless. The guy is unbelievable. He left it, he didn't believe he's in God's hand. He goes to battle. He said, well, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. Wow. And I told you I saw monsters. My Uncle Teddy was a hero. After my mom died, he was telling stories of what he did in World War II. He never talked about it as long, in all my life until my mom died. And then when we were sitting around our apartment, he started talking about it for the first time that I ever heard. It sent chills down my spine. I never saw him like that, and I never looked at him the same way after that. He was a true hero. He was unbelievable. And he didn't say it with pride, because warriors don't talk about this. Why do we hear over and over and over again, right? What do we hear over and over and over again when we watch the news, for example, or read posts on social media, right? What's the ultimate purpose you are following? Oral tradition. What is your ultimate purpose that you're following? Or do you just drift from story to story? And you just thought this is a story about monsters. Well, think again. Fame comes to men who mean it to win it and care about nothing else. In the Iliad, Achilles' mother, Thetis, said, "There's two paths for you, son. If you go to you can fight in the Trojan War and die young, or you can come home and live a long, uneventful life. If you stay and fight, your name will last forever. If you go home, no one will ever remember your name." And of course, if you saw the movie Troy with Brad Pitt, which is a great movie, actually, follows the story pretty well. He decides he wants fame, so he decides to fight young. And if you remember what they call an Achilles heel, she held him over the river to make him invulnerable. Nothing can kill him, except Paris shot the arrow in his ankle because she had to hold him by the ankle when she dipped him as a baby into the river to make him invulnerable, right? So that's why they call it till today the Achilles heel. What's your Achilles heel? What's your weak spot? What's your weak spot? But Achilles, like Beowulf, wanted glory. Michael Jordan wanted to be the best basketball player ever. He shot thousands of free throws a day. And so I think the word here you're looking for is focus. Because Beowulf lived a long time, 50 years, right, before the dragon came. So you can have, but focus is the key. You have to focus. But focus means you have to know the difference between peripheral vision and central vision. Central vision is when you're looking at the word. Look at the word same. Just focus on that word right now. Focus on the word same. Without moving your eyes, you can read the words around it. The goes. Can you see that? And right below it, you wow. You don't have to move your eyes. That's called peripheral vision. You need both types of vision. But focus is better. And what's focus? It's honing in on what you want to do, what you're going to do, how you're going to do it. And just focus that you got to do it, right? But you can't just focus. You got to have your peripheral vision. When Jimmy started his business over 30 years ago, I lost track of time. I pulled in for a McDonald's burger one day. And the guy said, yeah, it's the weekend, it's Friday. I go, what? I had no idea. It was Friday. I had lost all sense of weekend because I worked weekends. So think about this. Think about your vision, your focus. God gives guidance to those who can find it from no one else. Where do you get your guidance? I told you I was going to bring this line up again. Where do you get your guidance? This is the influence of religion. So do you pray? Is praying good? Some people don't pray. I know people who don't pray. Some people don't believe in God. Those are called atheists, right? Which is okay. You have to do what you got to do. My point is when you're in the story of Beowulf and you study the story of Beowulf, you cannot deny the influence of what they call God. I showed you how you can substitute Odin. If you believe before they wrote it down in the oral tradition, maybe Odin was used. I don't know. Makes sense. But where do you go for guidance? Where do you go for guidance? Do you have a panel discussion? Do you go to your priest? Or do you turn to drugs for your guidance? What do you do? This is important. Well, Jimmy, I just wanted to read a monster story. Good. It's more than a monster story. Where do you go for guidance? And if you think that this is not true, that when you can find guidance from no one else, this God, your God, our God, doesn't provide it, you're missing the point. It's just like you don't believe in monsters. Ladies and gentlemen, you better look around closer. What dangers he met, what battles he fought, graver and forever triumph till this day. Fate sent him to the dragon and sent him to his death. So fate was really defined as events that are supernatural power. It's used interchangeably with the word God. Do you believe in fate? Destiny? It's my destiny. or is it your destiny? Self-fulfilling prophecy, you've heard of that. Did Beowulf have this self-fulfilling prophecy? Did Michael Jordan have the self-fulfilling prophecy? Did he see himself as the best basketball player ever? Right? And he was. I was fortunate to see him play 3 games live. I've never seen a guy fly, except till I saw him. There's nobody like that, ever. Consider the next quote. His soul sensed how fate had come, felt something, not fear, but knowledge of old age. Remember when he was facing the dragon? He knew. He sensed. He wasn't scared. He just was old. He got old. It's different when you get old. And still he continued. This guy's amazing. He's an amazing hero. He's an amazing guy to hold up and say, you want to be like this guy. For the first time in his life, the famous prince fought with fate against him. He never fought with fate against him. And glory denied him. Remember, that's what he wanted, glory. Although he did get it in the end. He got the tower. He knew, but raised his sword, struck the dragon's scaly hide. The blade broke, drew blood, but it cracked and failed before it went deep enough. And it helped him less. Of course, then Wiglaf came along. One of them remained, stood there miserable. Wiglaf is miserable because now he's got to fight. Oh, everybody else ran, but he's miserable. But then he remembered, as a good man must, what kinship should mean. He overcame his fear. This is Wiglaf, right? Cousins had joined in the dragon's death, yet what they did, all men must do. All men must do. When the time comes. What does that mean? Well, when the time comes to kill a monster, you stick it out together. You don't run away. Gold can easily defeat the strongest of men, right? They can do that. His mother's sad heart. This is Grendel's mother, revenge. Confucius said, before you embark on a journey of revenge, dig 2 graves. Yours and the person you're going to do revenge on, right? Revenge as a motivation is great. It appears in many books. The Count of Monte Cristo is a story about revenge. It's a great story. I think we may read that one day. Hamlet, which we did read already on this website, Iliad. And that's it. I want to end with this quote. I can leave this life happy. I can die here knowing the Lord of all life has never watched me wash my sword in blood born of my own family. If we can say that when we're dying, I can leave this life happy and I can die here knowing the Lord of all life has never watched me wash my blood, wash my sword in blood born of my own family. I didn't kill my own family. I just fought evil. I think I'd like to go like that. You've been reading with Jimmy. This is the analysis of Beowulf. A little long, but worth it. Analyze. And if you want to go back and reread it, please do so. Email me, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Reading with Jimmy, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. Remember, be focused. Do not be afraid to confront monsters. Thank you for joining me. See you next time.